The creation of optimal high school timetables remains a significant challenge in the evolving educational landscape, driven by the need for personalized and flexible learning experiences. This paper proposes an extension to the XHSTT format, enabling the encoding of flexible student course choices and class formation requirements in an adaptive manner. This innovation addresses the limitations of traditional constraint encoding, allowing for the representation of each student's individual academic interests. The proposed extension is motivated by recent research highlighting the trend towards enabling students to follow their individual interests, and its constraints provide additional flexibility by allowing students to specify preferences and alternatives in their course selections. The new constraints are designed to model student choices on the individual level, making them particularly suited for high school instances. An ILP formulation extending the state-of-the-art ILP formulation by Christensen et al. Is provided, along with 18 publicly available instances that include the new constraints. Initial results for upper bounds using the ILP are also presented. The extension includes new constraint categories for student choices, class size requirements, and class size balance. The student choice constraint is designed to model course choices, teaching preferences, and other requirements, considering parameters such as student IDs, course preferences, and weights for each choice. The research provides a unified way to encode timetable requirements, reflecting recent developments and the challenges faced by schools in creating timetables. The new constraints are based on a study involving European experts, ensuring they are practical and useful for real-world scenarios. The paper outlines possible directions for future research, including the potential for improvements in automatic timetabling for modular high schools. The research introduces novel constraints to model individual student preferences in high school timetables. The student choice constraint ensures each resource attends a specified number of event groups, allowing for weighted preferences. Class sizes are dynamically managed by modeling 3 resource types: teachers, rooms, and individual students. The XHSTT format is used to model these restrictions, including times, resources, events, and constraints. Events have durations and are assigned to time slots, with solution events specifying resource requirements. Hard constraints are added to ensure only chosen students are assigned, and to prevent split assignments. The approach allows for unique student schedules and balanced class sizes by introducing minimum requirement events and maximum requirement events. Balance class size constraints, limit class size differences to ensure flexibility in scheduling. This novel ILP formulation extends existing work by incorporating these new constraints, resulting in more personalized and balanced timetables. The extended modular XHSTT problem introduces individuality into students' high school timetables by incorporating various entities and variables. It involves times, time groups, resources, events, event groups, event resources, subevents, and constraints. The model uses functions to calculate the cost of constraint violations, including sum, sum square, and square sum cost functions. Dummy resources and times are introduced to represent no resource or time assignments, and durations for events and subevents are defined. The constraints are applied to events, resources, and event groups, with each constraint having a weight and upper and lower limits. The objective is to minimize the total cost of constraint violations, balancing the need to satisfy all constraints while minimizing the overall cost. The research extends the objective function to include new constraint types, considering the costs of hard and soft constraints, deviation from new constraints, and additional terms. Novel constraints ensure balance in class sizes and student choices. The model size was reduced by eliminating unnecessary variables, focusing on feasible subevents. The evaluation uses 18 high schools in Germany as a benchmark, considering the diversity in secondary educational systems. This approach aims to create more personalized and efficient timetables, addressing the complexity of student and event constraints. The research introduces individuality into high school timetables by leveraging the UNTI's GmbH dataset, which includes scheduling problems from various schools worldwide. The dataset was anonymized and then translated into the XHSTT format for encoding constraints. This process enabled the creation of more instances in the future. The instances are characterized by complex constraints, including student and teacher availability, subject attendance, and global constraints on lunch breaks. The complexity is further increased by varying school sizes and proportions of modular events. Tables 1 and 2 provide statistics on the instances, including the number of events, students, classes, teachers, and rooms, as well as the number of choice and balance constraints, and modular events. The data aims to cover a wide range of possible instance spaces, with plans for future extensions to include more schools from across Europe. The authors introduce an extension to the XHSTT format to accommodate constraints present in modular high schools, providing 18 new real-world instances from German high schools and an ILP model to find feasible schedules. The ILP model is evaluated, and results show that using it as an exact method is ineffective, struggling to provide satisfactory solutions even with a 6-hour time limit. Here is a combined summary of pages 17-20 of the research paper. The authors propose an adaptive learning-based neighborhood search (LNS) approach to improve high school timetabling, incorporating methods from reinforcement learning to adapt to individual schools' needs. This approach is supported by providing more benchmark instances from across Europe and a publicly available tool for validation. The authors also plan to compare future findings with actual school timetables to bridge the gap between theory and practice. The paper references various studies on timetabling problems, including integer programming techniques for educational timetabling, hybrid local search-based solvers, and modeling and solving university course timetabling problems. These references highlight the complexity of timetabling problems and the need for innovative solutions. The ILP formulation for the high school timetabling problem is presented, consisting of several constraints, including general constraints, link variables, and subevent constraints. These constraints ensure that the model accurately represents the timetabling problem and provides exact objective values. Specifically, the constraints include linking variables for student course day and student course day instance, ensuring that each student is assigned to only one course per day. The paper then presents a series of constraints and equations that aim to allocate resources and time efficiently for various events, categorized as link variables, assign resource, assign time, split events, and distribute split events. These constraints utilize parameters such as bamountc, bamountsid, bdirc, and bdirc to control the number of subevents and their durations within an event. The distribute split events constraints aim to distribute the subevents evenly across the available time slots, using parameters BC, BCT, and DCT. The use of precise language and domain-specific terminology demonstrates the author's expertise in the field. Mathematical equations and algorithms are employed to model these constraints and optimize the scheduling process. The paper includes figures, tables, and graphs that illustrate the concepts and results, providing visual aids for the reader. The research introduces a novel framework for scheduling events in high school timetables, focusing on individuality and optimization. 7 constraints are formulated to ensure efficient and personalized timetables. The prefer resources constraint considers resource availability, while the preferred times constraint schedules events within preferred time slots. The avoid split assignments constraint and spread events constraint optimize event grouping and distribution. The link events constraint connects events within groups, and the order events constraint regulates event sequences. Constraints for avoiding clashes and unavailable times are also presented. These constraints are mathematically formulated using equations and variables, providing a sophisticated approach to event scheduling. The research then delves into constraints applied to resources and event groups. The limit idle times constraint minimizes idle times between events for each resource using binary and integer variables. The cluster busy times constraint limits the number of busy times within a cluster, ensuring that the number of busy times does not exceed a specified threshold. The limit workload constraint restricts the workload of a solution resource, calculated based on event duration and length. The balance class size constraint balances class sizes within an event group using variables and parameters. Finally, the student choice constraint considers student preferences in the timetabling process, although its details are not fully elaborated in these pages. Throughout these constraints, the paper employs mathematical equations and algorithms to model relationships between resources, events, and time groups. The use of binary and integer variables, along with various parameters, defines and enforces the constraints essential for creating an optimal high school timetable. The authors introduce a novel approach to individualize high school timetables by incorporating student preferences into the scheduling process. The model uses parameters BC and BC to denote the minimum and maximum values specified in constraint C element of C. The objective function, formulated as an integer linear program, ILP, aims to minimize the total deviation from student preferences. The authors introduce constraints to ensure that the produced schedule is valid and optimal, as shown in equation 111. To mitigate the issue of suboptimal objective values, they propose adding binary indicators to specify which constraint to use based on the current assignments. These indicators, binmax and binmin, are used to add constraints 112 and 113. The authors further extend this approach to handle constraints of the form x1 is less than or equal to s, x2 is less than or equal to s, xn is less than or equal to s, where xi may represent an arbitrary linear expression. They propose modeling these constraints using the max constraint, 114, which the ILP solver can automatically transform into a set of linear constraints. The use of general constraints, such as indicator constraints and max constraints, allows for a more flexible and accurate modeling of the timetabling problem.